Hi, everybody. This is Mindy with Mental Health and Addiction Services. We are still having a lot of people signing in, so we're going to wait about 3 minutes before we get started. And we have everybody on mute, and I'll walk through how the webinar is organized in just a couple minutes. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services go-to webinar on our new quality housing criteria. I'd like to thank everybody. We're really excited to have this opportunity to talk with everybody. The first thing we're going to do today is go around the room and do introductions for all of the department staff that are here participating in the webinar.
Roma Barrickman, part of the Housing and Homelessness Program and Policy Team.
Mara Klein, also with the policy team.
Stu Frey, also with Housing and Homelessness Policy Team.
Kevin James, with the Housing, Policy, and Homeless Team.
Jody Lynch, Deputy Director, Treatment and Recovery Support.
All right, thank you, everybody. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is the webinar expectations, which will provide an overview of our new quality housing criteria. We're going to go through a PowerPoint with historical background and general information. We do have a few poll questions to ask. I'm getting ready to launch the first one in just a couple minutes. And then we are going to give everybody an actual walkthrough of the quality housing criteria. We're also going to show everyone where to find information on our website. At any time during the webinar, please feel free to submit questions on the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Everybody's muted, and we will be answering questions as best we can as we go through the PowerPoint. And then we will do a brief review before we end the PowerPoint. Everybody is currently muted, and that really is just an attempt to limit background noise so that everybody can hear the information in a clear way. And we hope that all the information that we have provided will be helpful to everyone. So before Roma kicks things off, I'm going to go ahead and launch the first poll question. If you could answer, please. We're just really trying to get a flavor of who all is participating on the go-to, and then once we have the answers, we will kind of jump in and let everybody know the information. So Roma, would you like to start?
So good morning, afternoon, actually. So today we're going to be covering the following items in this presentation: the introduction and background. We're going to go over the mental health housing values. We're going to talk about the quality housing criteria. We're going to go through implementation. There's some additional information we wanted to share as it applies to the quality housing criteria. We've received a lot of questions around the state opioid response program. So we are going to spend a few minutes just making sure everyone is clear what that is. And then, of course, we'll have time for questions as we go through. It's going to be really helpful if you can pull up the criteria as we walk through this, because we will be referencing directly from that document as we are presenting. While we plan on giving some general information about the implementation today, please understand that really the purpose of today is to give an overview of the criteria itself. We will, once implementation is more firmed and we have ready to roll that out, we will be having more calls and more face-to-face technical assistance sessions as we get ready for implementation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about background. As many of you are aware, as you've been around for a while, mental health, addiction services, and your local ADMH boards have been in the business of doing housing since the late 1980s. Safe, decent, and affordable housing has always been our goal and the priority of any of the housing that we have funded and supported. The system is always focused on quality through very many other sources: housing quality standards with Section 8, licensure certification with licensure guidelines. Ohio Recovery Housing has a certification process. Federal grant requirements, such as HUD has its own requirements. Vouchers have some additional quality standards that are expected to be held. The intent of this is not to supersede or any of those existing requirements through federal, state, other funders. This is really to make sure that we are putting everything under one umbrella in terms of the housing that the department and local boards support and fund. It's just a single document that articulates in a shared understanding. It is the minimum quality standards that the department would expect on any project. Of course, we always want to achieve for the highest of quality, especially when we're talking about housing, but these are just going to be some minimum standards. The criteria consolidates all local, state, federal guidelines that we've used in the past. For those of you, again, who have been around for a really long time, we've always had documents that have come out about what's important, definitions, through different funding sources. So we're trying to attempt to put all of them under one document this time. Also want to point out that there's Ohio Revised Code 5119.22. This is the criteria to which it's the requirement that the department establish criteria by which each local board in alcohol, drug addiction, mental health services reviews and evaluates quality, effectiveness, and efficiency of facility services, addiction services, mental health services, and recovery support. So again, we just wanted to point to that because it has been in ORC. We're just really making a solidified effort at this time to put them all under one document.
So just before Roma gets to the next slide, I just thought I would share with everybody the results of the first poll. So we have about 40% of individuals on today's webinar represent Community Behavioral Health Authority. About 30% are, recovery housing operators. 13% are adult care facility operators. 2% are permanent supportive housing operators, and about 20% are with community providers.
Remember, as we go along, if you have any questions, you can please put them in the thing, and we will be trying to address them at the end of this presentation. Wanted to make sure as we all move forward that mental health and addiction services have some housing values and principles. It's very important that all our housing environments will be safe and affordable. They ensure access to natural supports and allow visitors of individual's choice. They be integrated in and have full access to the community. They be selected by the individual from a choice of housing options. They ensure privacy, dignity, respect, and freedom for cohesion and restraint. That the housing environments include a trauma-informed care practices and principles. That they optimize autonomy and independence in making life choices. Provide access to services in supports within the community and based on individual choice. And then where necessary, provide special accommodations within policies and procedures for those with maybe physical disabilities or other types of disabilities. We're going to actually pull up the criteria for you as we review the next group of slides.
Okay, this is Mara, and I'll be kind of walking you through the document. And again, this is a very brief overview, just to kind of walk you through what's in the document. If you have any questions, please feel free to give us a call or email. And of course, we're here to answer your questions while we walk through, so feel free to input those questions. So the housing settings that are specifically included in this document include permanent supportive housing, recovery housing, and residential facilities class 2. But we should note that regardless of how a board or operator defines the setting, any entities seeking funds distributed by the department or local behavioral health authority are covered by the policy. And please note that state funds include operating and capital dollars. We also wanted to include that time-limited temporary housing will be included and covered by this policy, but we'll be working on including those housing settings as we move forward. So the way that we went through this document, we wanted to pull out both physical environments as the first section and then programmatic environments as the second, basically to encompass both, the structured dwelling unit, common areas, and premises under physical environment, and then under programmatic environment, that was included as policies and procedures regarding services and supports that are in place within the housing to enable it to function effectively. And under physical environment, we basically wanted to make sure that all of those elements were covering each one of the housing settings. And then under programmatic environment, we actually had one section which encompassed all housing settings, and then it was further broken down by setting type, which was PSH, recovery housing, and residential facility, and that's to address individual characters of each. Under physical environment, we broke down each criteria by code and licensing enforcement, legally enforceable lease or resident agreement, Ohio building codes, fire and safety inspections, physical structure, physical space assurances, housing conditions, resident access, disaster planning, building maintenance, and operating budget. There's quite a bit of information in there. So as much as we'd like to go through each of those sections, again, we'll be doing some more training and technical assistance down the line in order to make sure that folks understand all of the information that's in the document. Under general programmatic environment, it's broken down into policy and procedure manual, non-discrimination policy, prohibition against brokering, move-in procedures, waiting lists, program rules, resident rights, grievance procedure, staffing policies, visitors, confidentiality documentation, and resident records and policies. And then underneath general programmatic environment, you actually find what I've mentioned before, broken down by housing-specific environments. And this was broken down into permanent supportive housing, recovery residences, and residential facility class 2. Each of those sections has the OhioMHAS housing categories and definitions, which you'll find that document on our page, and there's actually a link included in the document. Lease, housing, or resident agreement requirements for each, a quality standard protocol, and other policies specific to housing settings not contained in existing local, state, or federal law.
This is Sue, and I'm going to talk a little bit about implementation and the process for applications. Our tentative timeline is January 1st, 2020 to have everybody up and going. However, that's a tentative date. So we will keep you informed of of that timeline. As we stated earlier, we plan to have training academies to go through the application process along the way. So if you have a lot of questions about the application, we will be coming out with that schedule soon. I forgot to mention that some funding sources may require a due date prior to January 1st, 2020. The application process is going to be through a third-party contractor. We will be contracting with a third-party provider to handle the applications, to review the applications, and to approve or deny the applications, and to help answer questions about the application process. Incomplete applications may receive technical assistance from the contractor or OhioMHAS staff to reduce the potential for denial. Once the application is complete, it will be approved or denied. A letter will be sent to you, and all approved applications will be added to a centralized database. Applications will be on our website. They are not there yet. We will notify you once they are up and running. There will be an application and signature document specific for each housing setting that Maura already described. So there'll be an application and signature page for recovery housing, an application and signature page for residential facility class 2s, and a separate one for permanent supportive housing. And there's a little bit of required information they will be specific to each one of those. And so when you're doing the process for application, make sure you have the right one. If you have any questions, you can contact Maura or I, and our information is right there. Application questions will be directed to the vendor after they have been assigned. So we have a little bit of additional information. We will not address questions related to the current funding announcements related to the RFP during this session. There was an RFP released on January 2nd for the vendor that we just talked about. And this is not for operating funds for boards or housing operators. If you have any call or questions related to the RFP, please refer to the funding website. There's a scheduled call on January 16th at 1:30 p.m. if you have questions directly about the RFP.
Okay. So we also wanted to just briefly mention the state opioid response program, because there's some funding out there related to that funding source. And we've received some questions related to that. And of course, we didn't really want to address a lot of issues related to that, but we did want to bring it up because some of this quality criteria process directly relates to that. And basically, the state opioid response program is federal funding from SAMHSA focused on building systems of care, basically prevention, early intervention, treatment, and recovery support. There was a local response project RFA released December 4th, and for that funding, housing might be eligible, and that funding was going toward 2 boards and hospital regions who are the people that were eligible to apply for that. There will be another RFA released sometime, hopefully soon, for those of you who are interested, and that funding will be available to boards as well to provide housing for persons in recovery from opiate use disorder and their families in a setting that meets the quality housing criteria. So again, that funding will also be available to boards and not housing operators. But again, we wanted to just at least mention that and let folks know that there'll be more information coming out about that RFA soon. And the information, you should actually go onto the funding page on our website to find out more about state opioid response program and funding. And then the contact for additional questions is Ellen Augsburger, and her phone number and email address are located on this page. And I'm sure she'd be super psyched if you call her and email her for more information. And then lastly, the additional webinar dates and times if you wanted more information to cover this again, is January 17th from 1 to 2:30 and February 20th from 1 to 2:30. We'll also be posting this webinar and recording on our website hopefully shortly, so that you can review it as many times as you'd like. Oh, and our FAQs we'll be posting and updating as people are coming in with questions. So, and this is the email address that you should send questions to. Any questions?
So in an attempt, we've heard lots of feedback that they felt like we went a little too fast through the actual quality housing criteria. So we thought we'd bring back up the actual document and sort of just walk through it a little bit slower. Again, there's a lot of the items in here that when it comes down to implementation will become a lot clearer and a lot more prescribed. But for the purpose of today, really, we just want to make sure that everyone understands that in terms of overview, this directly relates to requirements that the department has to establish criteria around housing. Really, it's specific to the department's defined housing settings: permanent supportive housing, recovery housing, residential facility class 2s and 3s, and time-limited or temporary housing settings. They've been really just, again, developed to articulate just the minimum criteria that we are hoping to all achieve in housing for the populations that we serve. These do apply to any housing setting. Again, as most of you may know, our definitions that the department has set forward may not necessarily match what a local system has as a defined housing setting, but if it is to receive funding from the department via any federal grants, state grants, capital dollars or operating dollars through the department, or local levy dollars, then it does go based on the department's definitions in those housing settings. Again, we have have had four overarching goals in housing, which is to develop new housing, to preserve the existing housing in the state, to really assist operators with sustainability and improved housing operations. And last but not least, we want to have a high quality environment to the individuals that we serve, meaning with their not only environment, but the services that they receive in that housing. Again, as Maura described, we attempted to streamline how we broke quality criteria out by breaking it down to two types of environment. There's the physical environment, which is the bricks and mortar. The definition of a physical environment is the structure, a dwelling, the dwelling unit, any common areas, and the overall premises. In terms of the programmatic, that's referring to anything that happens inside the walls. So policies, procedures, how residents are treated, what expectations set forth in terms of participation in certain events or programs. I'll go back to this. With programmatic, that really depends on each individual environment and the type of housing that you are operating. So for instance, what programmatic elements would happen in an adult care facility, those class 2s, would be different in terms of what happens in a permanent supportive housing environment. So we want to make sure that we pay attention to the needs of operators and the individuals in each of those environments.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yep.
Just because I'm getting lots of questions about implementation. And so we are today just trying to give an overview of the quality criteria. As we have more details about implementation, we'll be releasing that information. So details about where to find the application, what is the application process, we are still working through those. So as soon as we have that information, we will be having a follow-up webinar to this 3-part series that will provide all of that information in detail.
Again, under physical environment, we want to really just stress that the items that are being addressed in this are not anything that would be new to any of you as a housing provider, developer, operator. When you are looking to purchase a building, renovate a building, operate in a building, these are all items that you have already experienced doing or would be doing if you were to purchase something. So these aren't a surprise and they're not added in any shape, way, or fashion. But really importantly, under physical environment, it's a legally enforceable lease or resident agreement. Code and licensing enforcement. Again, this is really huge. Every county, all 88 of them in Ohio, have their own local codes and enforcement and zoning issues. So again, we are not going to be specific that in this county it's this, in this county it's that. It's that as an operator, you need to make sure that you understand what is in your county and what those regulations are. I just jumped, sorry. A building code, same thing. Every county, every housing setting has an occupancy that you cannot exceed. Please work, again, with your local enforcement to determine what that is for your county. Some it's 5 or less, some there isn't any. So we're not going to put a statewide minimum maximum because we're going to ensure that you are working with your local authorities on that. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, one thing that we probably should talk about is the physical structure piece. It's right underneath fire and safety inspections. And this was one thing that we had extensive discussions here at the department and with our stakeholders. And that is that at a minimum, you would either need to be licensed as a residential facility class 2 and meet certification standards, or meet HUD HQS as completed by an authorized inspector, or have a completed home inspection showing no structural deficits, or have a completed ORH, Ohio Recovery Housing Dwelling Inspection checklist. And so that's something that we're going to be working with folks as we go through the implementation phase. And again, that's something that we'll discuss with folks later on. That is something to make sure that you're reviewing, because it is something that we're asking folks to do to ensure the physical structure has no threat to the health and safety of occupants. So make sure you look through that and review it. And we'll, of course, there'll be lots of time to make sure that your home, meets, or home or facility meets that standard, but to make sure that you're just reviewing it closely.
Fire safety inspections. This has always been really huge on the department's list since the beginning of time. It is an expectation that annually your property would be inspected to meet fire and safety. Some counties, the fire marshals come out. Other counties, the boards have developed a really good fire inspection tool that they actually pay someone to come out. So it's going to depend on your community, but at the minimum, you need to probably be working with your local fire department to make sure that someone is coming out to inspect the smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, that things are working, and that they're up to date. Physical space assurances. Again, we know that every type of housing is its own housing environment, but there are some basics that are shared among all housing settings. There should be no interventions in place similar to those used in an institutional setting. So no seclusion, no chemical, physical restraints, locking doors, locking people in their rooms, and no controlled schedule like you would in a institutional setting. Ensure residents have access to typical home areas. So there should always be access to kitchens and dining rooms, laundry, living rooms, entertainment areas. Ensure, be designed in a manner that allows for adequate space. So, which supports resident choice in controlling their own schedule. I know we're not actually building, and for this, you're not going to be asked to rebuild an environment, but when you have your environment or looking at environments, there needs to be spaces that folks can control their own schedules or activities of daily living. So bathing, eating, exercising, laundry facilities. Also strive to accommodate individuals' choice of roommate if residents share bedrooms. Again, sometimes this may not be all entirely possible depending on sort of when a person enters the housing or the type of environment, but at minimum as possible, try to accommodate roommate preferences. Permanent supportive housing, we recommend the Ohio Housing Finance Agency design and architectural standards. There is a minimum square footage requirement of 450 feet for PSH per unit. Recovery residences, do you want to go through recovery residences?
Sure. Again, these criteria we worked with stakeholders to develop these, but a lot of the ones that are included here, we actually designed them very closely with our residential facility standards. So yeah, that's how we kind of came up with some of these. But we do not want recovery residents to have more than 2 adults per bedroom, to have a maximum occupancy of 16 adults, including staff who live on site living in a single family structure. They should meet a minimum square footage requirement of 450 square feet per individual unit when operating apartment structures or similar residential properties. And these structures should exceed the maximum occupancy of 16 adults at the discretion of OhioMHAS. And we want to grant OhioMHAS the right to evaluate all recovery residences in excess of 16 adults to ensure they're in compliance with the entirety of the criteria prior to any funding approval. They should meet a minimum square footage requirement in each bedroom of 70 square feet for the first bed and 50 square feet for each additional bed. They should have at least 1 sink, 1 toilet, and 1 shower per 6 residents. And each resident must have their own personal item storage space and food storage space and must always have access to these areas. I should add that we're very aware that we are currently funding some recovery residences that don't meet one or many of these criteria. We will be working with boards and operators to ensure that we can find a common ground when moving forward, and that will take place with the implementation process. So again, please don't jump to conclusions and believe that you're going to lose your funding tomorrow because this came out today. We'll be working with folks to figure out a way to move forward.
For RF2s, we followed the licensing and certification, Ohio Administrative Code. Sorry, residential class 2, I'm sorry. So we will be, as I said, we're following what's already set with your standards for licensure and certification.
Sorry. Housing conditions. The housing and any equipment contained must be maintained in sanitary conditions. Again, really important. We just want to make sure that the inside of the facility and the outside of the facility are kept clean, that there are not any structure issues that could cause injury to residents, be kept free of insect and rodent infestation. Just that the house is something that you would want to live in yourself. It's really, we kind of go with that. Resident access. Housing settings should always be accessible and available. If the housing is locked during any portion of the 24-hour day, each resident shall be provided with a working key or access code, or staff needs to be available to unlock that door when residents come in. We are not in the business of locking the doors and not letting people back. So we want to really keep that in mind. Again, disaster planning. This is really important, although I am told by my 14-year-old daughter that Ohio is actually one of those places that does not get natural disasters. It does happen anyway. There are certain parts of the South that really get flooding. that where their generators go out often because of electrical failure. There are places in Ohio that have had tornadoes. So please make sure that you have a plan in place for your residents, that if you have to evacuate, you know exactly what's going to happen. You practice that plan so that you are eliminating any potential distress to the residents and staff as well. And building maintenance. Again, the housing setting shall provide for interior and exterior repairs. We're going to encourage, when we do our operator trainings, schedules for when you're going to look at certain things like roof replacements and furnace replacements. But that should be something as part of your policies and procedures and how you're operating the facility. Last but not least is an operating budget. As we all know, operating funds are always tight in every housing setting. We are not going to pretend that everyone has a plethora of dollars to operate, but you must have a budget that accounts for the management and operations of that facility or that housing setting. You want to make sure that you're recording and probably yearly evaluating those monthly expenses. And you should have a replacement and or maintenance reserve items so that you can plan for those big items. It should be specific to the structure's address. So you want to have it, if you have 5 houses, you want to have a specific operating budget for each address so that you can properly plan for the expenses on that house and not make general statements. Do you want to do a poll?
Yeah. So we're going to go ahead and do our next poll, which we will have open for about a minute. We're trying to figure out what part of the state that everyone who is participating in the webinar is located. So if you could please answer that poll, we will get that down in just a second. Thank you.
So we're going to keep going and walk a little bit further into the
We already got it.
Quick. Yeah, it comes up quick.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So it looks like 20% of folks live in Central Ohio, 18% live in Northwest Ohio, 38% live in Northeast Ohio, 6% or 16% live in Southwest, and 9% live in Southeast. Great.
Okay, so we're going to walk a little bit through the programmatic environment section. And again, this section largely includes the policies and procedures regarding services and supports that are in place within the housing to enable it to function effectively. And there's a large chunk of this which is encompasses all the housing settings, and then it's broken down further by setting type: PSH, recovery housing, and residential facilities. So first of all, you will want to make sure that your housing setting includes a policy and procedure manual. And written documents should be present and available at all times to residents and include, at a minimum, mission and goals, description of services provided, description of population served, resident capacity, fiscal policies, a protocol for responding to emergencies on a 24-hour basis, which we already covered a little bit, resident rights and grievance procedures, and emergency contact information for staff and residents. You should have a policy and procedure for non-discrimination. Here we've got information about a prohibition against brokering, which there's a lengthy definition here. A move-in procedures and resident selection process should have a policy and procedure. And then also programs should maintain a process for resident waiting lists. There should be a process for program rules, and then also there's a section here about resident rights and grievance procedures. And I'd like to point out just a little bit under the grievance procedure, all settings that don't have a formal requirement for resident rights and grievance procedures, which we've got here the OAC 5122 both of those for resident rights and grievance procedures. If you're not already covered under that, we'd like you to make sure that you develop policies and procedures which meet those standards. And we've already received some questions about that, so there's going to be an answer to that in the FAQs that we're going to post later on. But basically, we're not expecting those settings to have something that's just exactly mirroring that that standard, but something that is in place and is a formal resident rights and grievance procedure. So we'll be helping folks with technical assistance regarding that later on, but that's something that you may need to consult some legal advice regarding. Staffing policies amongst housing types. There's some information there about background checks, making sure that you're basically following federal and state labor laws. And again, we're not trying to be providing legal advice here, but basically wanting to make sure that folks are seeking that when they need it. You want to make sure that you have policies and procedures in place regarding your staffing policies and making sure that you're following the law so that everybody's safe. Confident visitors. So that was something that was mentioned a little bit earlier. Individuals should be able to have visitors of their choosing at any time. If any limitations are present, you should make sure that these are addressed in the lease, housing, or resident agreement and must be addressed with individuals prior to move-in. Any confidentiality documentation, there should be policy and procedures regarding confidentiality of resident information, and as well as resident records, making sure that there's a policy and procedure to make sure that all of this information is kept secure. So that section was the Programmatic Environment section that basically applied to all housing settings, PSH, recovery housing, and residential facility. And starting at this section, it's broken down into each housing setting. So for PSH, we basically included the OhioMHAS definition here. And then at a minimum, properties must meet HUD, HQS for safety, security, and housing neighborhood conditions. There's information here about making sure that the lease agreement must meet landlord-tenant law. And then there's a reference below that to the interagency council, the definition here. And for recovery residences, we've also included the OhioMHAS definition, as well as information about the different levels of recovery residence. There's some information about choice, making sure that recovery residences must be person-centered in nature and practice and facilitate multiple pathways to recovery, including but not limited to a few options here. And again, ensuring that we're not limiting it to just a few different kinds of pathways to recovery, but that all residences are encouraging folks to find whatever helps them recover. We also want to make sure that homes do their best to accommodate all pathways to recovery, but in the event that something doesn't work for one person, they're able to refer out to other homes or other methods of recovery in the community. There's it's not really a definition of social model of recovery, but just information about a social model of recovery and reference to the NAR standards, which is National Alliance for Recovery Residences. There's information for what we would expect of a lease, housing, or resident agreement, as well as wanting to make sure that recovery residences follow the law for termination procedures, and there's a reference to the ORC Chapter 1923 here. And we did actually refer to quality standards in here, wanting to make sure that all recovery housing follows quality standards. We actually, at the time this was written, we referenced the NAR version 2.0. However, just recently a NAR standard version 3.0 came out. So as it happens, you release something and then right away have to update it. So, which we'll be doing hopefully eventually, who knows when. But we did want to make sure that folks know equivalent quality standards may be approved by OhioMHAS, but we would have to review those prior to approval. As far as length of stay, recovery housing shall not limit a resident's duration of stay to an arbitrary or fixed amount of time. Instead, each resident's duration of stay shall be determined by the resident's needs, progress, and willingness to abide by the recovery residence protocols. And that's actually straight from our Ohio Administrative Code. Relapse policies, homes must establish a relapse policy, and that's just something that I know Ohio Recovery Housing is working on as well, so we wanted to make sure that we're including that in our criteria. Medications, there must be a policy and procedure with regards to residents' prescription and non-prescription medication, and staff providing assistance with self-administration of medication must receive applicable training, including those related to naloxone. And finally, as well as supporting what we had earlier in the document, for staffing, homes should be adequately staffed to ensure safety, ensuring that there's policies and procedures in place both for supervision of staff and to ensure that the home is adequately safe. And then finally, residential facility class 2.
Again, we followed the Ohio Revised Code with this, and it is no different than it is for licensure and certification.
And if you have any questions about the rules regarding licensure and certification, please contact the licensure and certification office, and they can assist you with the rules. So there was a question that came up around how our housing environments following Housing First models. If you have a model that you call a Housing First model, you should try to achieve fidelity to that model. There are specific standards, goals, parameters around that model. It's very well published, primarily for the chronic homelessness. I would encourage you to go to Corporation for Supportive Housing's website. They have a lot of documents and trainings on Housing First fidelity. Again, Housing First is a type of permanent supportive housing. So if you have a Housing First model, it would fall under the PSH model in terms of physical and programmatic environments.
And again, a lot of the questions we can't answer directly because we're still working on the implementation plan. We just wanted to give everybody a high-level overview of the quality criteria, walk everyone through them. As we continue to establish more details, which will come after the selection of the RFP vendor, we will host an additional webinar in which we walk individuals through the specifics of the implementation plan. At that time, we'll do just a very general walkthrough of the quality housing criteria, but we'll do a deep dive into implementation. Again, if anyone has questions specific to the quality housing criteria, please send questions to qualityhousingcriteria@mha.ohio.gov. The entire housing team has access to that email account, and so they will all be checking to make sure that we can answer your questions as soon as possible. And if it's a question that we can't answer immediately, we will let you know and say, hey, we don't have those details yet, but as soon as we do, we'll be providing additional information to the field. And before we end the webinar, I think we all would like to thank all the stakeholders that participated in our stakeholder groups to make sure that the work that we were doing, made sense to the field. We always want to make sure that it doesn't just make sense to the staff at Ohio Mental Health and Addiction Services, but we want to make sure it makes sense to recovery housing operators, to advocacy organizations like Ohio Recovery Housing, NAMI, and so OCAR. We want to make sure that all those folks really, truly feel our appreciation for their participation. And we will be having a follow-up webinar. The next one is January 17th from 1 to 2:30. It will be just like the one today. And then our final one will be February 20th, which again will be just like today. So we would like to thank everybody for your participation. and we look forward to working with you to ensure quality housing for individuals with a substance use and/or mental health disorder. Thank you.